Ever since my younger brother, Ken, was brought back to our family, I've felt like I've been slowly pushed aside. To make it up to him, my father immediately gave him my job and put him in charge of a project I'd put my heart and soul into. When the project went wrong, my sister, Sarah, lied, and I ended up taking the blame for his mistakes. He was all alone, and my wife, Emily, was surprisingly caring toward him. She insisted that, as his older sister-in-law, she should act like a mother and take care of the brother I'd neglected for so long. Furious, and not willing to just let it go, I confronted him, but he punched me, and I fell down the stairs, breaking my leg. Just when I thought my mother would say something fair, she instead told me not to be so petty. Even my daughter Olivia thought it would be better if Ken were her father. In my hospital bed, feeling angry and frustrated, I had a sudden realization. It turned out I was just a minor bad guy character in an inspiring novel. All my hard work, all my sacrifices were just so the main character, Ken, could get all the rewards. Realizing what my life was supposed to be, I handed my wife and daughter over to Ken, gave up my inheritance, and left the country. But when everyone thought I was a loser, abandoned by everyone, I came back with a plan and took away Ken's rewards. When I first woke up, my so-called family members were still blaming me. My parents, who used to love me, now sided with my younger brother. My mother said, "Ken didn't mean to do it. Besides, you were too harsh when you argued with him. It's understandable that he panicked. You're both at fault, and it was just a small injury. Let's just move on. I'll handle it. Don't keep thinking about it." She looked at me kindly, hoping I would be like I used to be, grumbling but still doing what she wanted. And just as she hoped, I answered flatly, "All right." Her hand paused for a moment before she comforted me. "I know things haven't been easy for you. When you get out of the hospital, I'll have the housekeeper make you something delicious." I nodded silently. My sister, Sarah, frowned, looking at me. "I'll help with the project. You don't have to take responsibility for Ken anymore. Is that okay? Don't blame me. Ken is still new and can't handle that much pressure. Plus, there were mistakes in what you handed over." I clearly remembered that the documents I gave to Ken had everything detailed carefully. What file to check, which folder, which page. But Ken, being his usual rushed self, only skimmed through it, causing a major error in the numbers. Of course, I didn't argue with Sarah anymore. I simply grunted in response and stayed quiet. There was nothing to argue about. She knew the problem was Ken's, but to cover for him and protect him, she planned to blame it all on me. After my realization, her so-called selfless older sister act seemed ridiculous. My cold responses seemed to make them uneasy. My father spoke up. "Rest well, and once you're out of the hospital, come back to the company and help Ken. He's just joined and he needs to make a good impression. As his older brother, you should be more generous and help him out. Once he's settled, you can go back to your position." I looked at my father, wondering if he still remembered how proudly he used to say he treated all his children equally. When I joined the company, he insisted I start from the bottom. I had no problem with that at the time, and worked my way up from the very beginning for 8 years to get where I was. But when Ken mentioned joining the company, my father immediately gave him my position, letting him take over the project I was about to finish. I smiled at my father and said, "There's no need for me to go back to my position. When I'm out of the hospital, I'll handle everything that needs to be handed over." Father frowned and said, "Michael, what are you doing? Are you trying to make trouble?" I shook my head and replied calmly, "No, I'm just tired. I plan to quit." At that moment, Ken, who had been acting like a shy little bird, stood up and said, "Bro, I know I'm not qualified for this position, and having you help me is a waste of your skills. You don't need to quit. I should be the one to quit. As for what happened with you falling down the stairs, even though it was an accident, it was still my fault. I've been feeling guilty about it. I came here today to apologize. I didn't expect it to upset you even more. I'm sorry." He looked apologetic, but his eyes were full of scheming, unfortunately. Everyone except me only saw his expression. Father immediately scolded me. "I've taught you to be understanding since you were young. Is this how you treat your brother?" Mother shook her head sadly. Ken was kidnapped when he was born, and has suffered outside for so many years. It's only natural that we focus more on him now that we've finally found him. "Michael, why do you have to fight with the family over something like this?" Sarah looked at me coldly and said, "Dad, Mom, don't waste your time. Michael is acting like a spoiled kid, thinking everyone should do what he wants. You've been so patient. And does he even care? He's selfish." I barely managed a smile, remembering how things used to be before Ken came back, how warm my interactions with the family had been. But that warmth no longer made me feel anything. It seemed this was a side effect of my realization. I wasn't affected by unnecessary emotions anymore. I calmly replied to them, Yes, you're all right. But I'm tired now. Is that okay?" Sarah snorted and was about to speak, but my father interrupted. "All right, Michael needs rest. Let's go home for now. Once you're out of the hospital, we can talk properly as a family." Mother hesitated, then looked at me and said, "I'll come see you again in a few days." Ken turned to the woman beside him. "Sis-in-law, please take good care of my brother. And Olivia, remember to behave and not make your father angry, okay?" Sarah also said, "Sis-in-law, sorry for the trouble." Hearing the two siblings, I looked up to see Sarah patting Emily's arm, while Ken crouched down and gently told Olivia to behave. Looking at the disgust and disapproval in their eyes as they glanced at me, I suddenly realized that, in the midst of their talking, I had forgotten that my so-called wife and daughter were still in the room with me. After my parents left, only Emily and Olivia remained in the hospital room. Emily looked at me for a while and sighed. "You used to be so mature and calm. How did you become so unreasonable? Ken is your brother, and after suffering all those years, you should take better care of him. Why are you always fighting with him?" I agreed, replying, "You're right. As the older sister-in-law, I should take care of him. I'll leave him to you from now on. I'm tired and need to rest." She stamped her feet in anger and said, "What kind of person are you? I've told you so many times I take care of him because he's your brother. Can you think straight?" I was truly exhausted, so I didn't bother reminding her that in just 6 months, her way of referring to my brother had already changed to simply calling him Ken. At that moment, I heard a childish voice. "Dad, it's so low of you to argue with your own brother." 7-year-old Olivia pursed her lips, her eyes full of disdain and contempt. I used to find her maturity funny, but since Ken appeared, her maturity had turned into attacks against me. She thought I was too strict with her, didn't care about her, always focused on work, while her Uncle Ken often brought her small gifts. She hated that I always gave her uncle trouble and thought it was terrible. She clearly took after her mother. I smiled bitterly and said, "If it's so low, just deal with it. Soon enough, you'll be free of it." I closed my eyes and added, "All right, I really need to rest now." Just before I closed my eyes completely, I saw a flash of surprise and worry in Olivia's eyes. I heard Emily scolding her, saying, "What are you saying to a child?" I didn't open my eyes to look at her, but her voice too held a trace of anxiety. What are these two mother and daughter up to? I kept my eyes shut, and after a while, I heard Emily's voice again. "You rest and calm down. I'll take Olivia home." As soon as they left the room, I heard Olivia's voice outside. "Mom, if only Uncle Ken had been found sooner, then it would have been him marrying you, and my dad would have been him." Emily's voice was calm as she responded, "Don't talk nonsense." Then the mother and daughter gradually walked away. I listened to their conversation, but no longer felt the painful feeling I had before. Instead, I quickly drifted off to sleep. I dreamed of the past, I remembered when my parents and my sister Sarah were together, and we were a happy family. The Johnson family had once been close to going bankrupt, and with the money we had, we could only afford to send one of us to study abroad. My sister insisted on letting me go, no matter what. During those hardest times, my parents never complained, never reduced my living expenses, and never mentioned the family's financial problems. They were always worried about whether I was eating and sleeping well. Then I dreamed of Emily. We were college classmates, and after spending a lot of time together in the same club, I began to have feelings for her. She told me that she knew there was a big difference between our family backgrounds, and she wanted to become better so that she could be good enough for me. I insisted that my family never cared about things like that, but she still refused my financial help, insisting on splitting the living expenses and earning a scholarship through her own efforts. At that time, her love for me seemed so pure and genuine. I remembered once when one of her friends told her that a woman's youth is precious, that it's only natural to use a man's money, and that she shouldn't be fooled by me. As a result, Emily and her friend had a falling out and never spoke to each other again. My family knew we truly loved each other and supported us being together. Later, we got married and had Olivia. I once fell down a flight of stairs to save Olivia and was unconscious for 3 days and nights. The doctors said I almost didn't make it. When I woke up, I saw Emily crying by my bedside, her eyes full of tears, saying that if I didn't wake up, she wouldn't want to live either. The scenes in my dream kept changing. Then I dreamed of Olivia when she was 3 years old and got very sick. At that time, Emily was out of town and couldn't come back. I was in charge of a major project for Johnson, so I worked during the day and took care of Olivia at night, sleeping only 10 hours over the course of 7 days. After she recovered, I got very sick. Back then, little Olivia, with her red eyes, said she wanted to grow up quickly so she could take care of me and not let me work so hard. Sometimes I thought that my family life and my love life were perfect. Life had its challenges, but overall it was going smoothly, and I was happy. I thought I would continue to be happy forever. Until Ken appeared in my life. When I woke up, I blinked, and the memories of that dream seemed so far away, as if I were watching someone else's story. I stayed in the hospital for another 2 days, and after confirming that everything was fine, I was discharged. On the day I left the hospital, neither my parents nor Emily, who had said they would come pick me up, showed up. Instead, as I was trying to get a cab, I saw Ken's post on social media. He wrote, "Thanks to my dad, mom, sister, sister-in-law, and little niece for coming early this morning to celebrate my birthday." I smiled and scrolled past the post. They had indeed given me unforgettable family warmth, which is why I agreed, time and again, to give way to Ken when they asked me to. But now, I felt that enough was enough. I still have a bright future ahead of me, and can't keep drowning in this mess. When I got home, I began packing my things and suddenly felt frustrated. It wasn't because of them, but because I had lived in this house for so many years, and packing up all my belongings was going to take a lot of effort. I kept packing until around 7 p.m., when the two of them came back. Emily opened the door and, upon seeing me, looked guilty as she said, "Sorry, honey. We were celebrating Ken's birthday today, and I forgot you were discharged. I just took Olivia to the hospital and only realized you had already gone home." But soon, her tone shifted to one of blame. She continued, "You should have let us know you were leaving the hospital. You made me and Olivia run all the way there for nothing. Don't tell me you're mad about something small again." I shook my head and replied, "No, just busy, forgot to message you." She frowned and said, "How could you forget something like this? And what's so busy about just getting discharged?" I said, "Packing my clothes." She asked, "What's there to pack? By the way, Olivia and I rushed to pick you up, but we didn't have time to eat." Olivia walked over and awkwardly said, "I want shrimp noodle soup." This was her way of making up with me. Whenever we had an argument, she would soon come to me and ask for something she wanted to eat, and I would smile and go to the kitchen to cook it for her. Here I am, a vice president of a large corporation, managing so many employees. Yet for this mother and daughter, I would wash my hands and cook, learning to make meals. In the end, I had nothing and ended up in a terrible, sad situation. What was it all for? But by now I was also hungry. So I went into the kitchen, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw them both relax. 10 minutes later, I brought out a bowl of noodles and placed it on the table. Emily froze and asked, "Just one bowl?" Olivia stopped in her tracks and asked, "Did you put chili in it and chicken drumsticks?" Emily scolded, "How could you forget that Olivia doesn't eat spicy food or chicken?" I took a sip of soup and smiled. She doesn't eat it, but I do. I'm hungry too, so I thought it was fine to fill myself first, no problem. The expressions of the mother and daughter immediately darkened. Olivia said stiffly, "I'm not eating it." Emily shot me a cold glance and said, "I'll take Olivia out to eat." I ignored their retreating figures and happily finished my bowl of noodles. Then, I went back to packing. Once I was almost done, I called my lawyer to discuss the divorce. I definitely couldn't use Johnson's legal team. That would mean letting everyone know I was planning to divorce before I was ready. It was better to find someone I trusted more. Emily and Olivia didn't come home that night, but I wasn't bothered. After all, Emily was there as the mother, so there shouldn't be any problems. The next day, I went to the lawyer's office as planned. During the meeting, I received numerous calls, all from those so-called family members. I just muted the phone. When I finished the meeting and came out, it was already dusk. I randomly picked a number and called back. As soon as the call connected, I heard my mother's anxious voice. She said, "Michael, yesterday was Ken's birthday, and we forgot to pick you up from the hospital. That's wrong. But you can't just ignore your wife and child like that. If it wasn't for them going to find Ken, I wouldn't even know you're not taking care of them." I was speechless. The nanny was off that day, and there was no one at home. What else could I do? Besides, they aren't broke. They can go out to eat by themselves. She sighed. "Listen to Mom. Don't stay mad at your daughter-in-law. Ken feels guilty too, and you're making him uneasy. Your dad and sister don't want to see him upset." I replied, "Does that include you too?" She said, "Michael, don't say that. Both you and Ken are my sons. For Mom, the palms and backs of my hands are both the same." I asked in a neutral tone, "So, what do you want me to do?" She answered, "Just apologize first and make it up to them. Then explain to Ken so he can feel better. What's the point of arguing over right and wrong in a family?" I laughed. "Fine, but I've been busy lately. I'll go see them in 2 or 3 days." She said, "You child." I didn't wait for her to finish, hanging up the phone. I was thinking it's time to get the divorce over with. That would at least make things easier for them. When I got home, Emily and Olivia were already there. When they saw me, their faces were as cold as ice. Emily was the first to speak up. "I didn't come back last night with Olivia, and you didn't even care. Are you out fooling around?" I didn't want to explain that I wasn't out fooling around. I just said, "Well, you're the mother, right? I figured you'd take good care of her. Besides, you've said before that Olivia thinks I'm too strict as a father, and she's afraid when she sees me. You wanted me to give her some space, remember?" Both mother and daughter froze. They must have remembered that time when they didn't come home late, and Emily's calls went unanswered, almost making me call the police. Until I saw Ken's post on social media, I felt like a bucket of cold water had been dumped on me, from head to toe. The two of them had spent the day at a newly opened amusement park with Ken, and in the evening, they had dinner together. Strangers thought they were a family of 3, and even offered to take a picture for them. Ken's post had a photo of the 3 of them together, with a caption saying, "We were mistaken for a family of 3, LOL." He was using this to shut me up, leaving me no excuse to confront him. After all, he had already said it was just for fun. After 10 p.m., I finally heard the sound of them opening the door. When I sharply questioned them, Emily replied disdainfully, "Olivia needs her personal space, so don't be so controlling. And you didn't need to be in such a hurry. I'm the mother. Of course, I'll take care of Olivia." Olivia didn't speak, but her expression mirrored her mother's, cold and impatient. I shook off my thoughts and smiled at them. "I hope you had fun. I'll go wash up now. By the way, I've already eaten out. If you haven't, you can order takeout. The nanny won't be back until tomorrow." Olivia suddenly spoke up, nervously saying, "There's a movie coming out next month that's perfect for a family of 3 to watch. Next month, by mid-month, if all goes smoothly, Emily and I would have passed the waiting period and gotten the divorce papers." I smiled at Olivia and said, "I'm busy, but you can ask Uncle Ken. He should be happy to take you." Olivia stood there, a hurt expression flashing in her eyes. Her temper flared, and she said stiffly, "You're right. I'll go with Uncle Ken then." With that, she stormed off to her room and slammed the door. Both mother and daughter were fond of slamming doors. Witnessing this, Emily angrily said, "Michael, have you had enough? Olivia was trying to make amends and you had to act all sarcastic. She's still a child. When did your heart become so small?" Then her tone shifted, and she looked exhausted, saying, "Michael, I know you're mad at me. I can change. Olivia will change too. Please don't act like this, okay?" If she had said this any day before I went to the hospital, I would have told myself to let the past go. After all, they were my wife and child. I should trust them. But now, it was too late. For the past 3 years, after every argument, I wanted to sit down and have a heart-to-heart talk with her. I just wanted to talk to her. But every time, Emily would somehow change the topic and accuse me of not admitting my mistakes. In the end, it would always turn into her criticizing me, and Olivia would bluntly tell me she didn't want to listen. If I wanted her to get closer to me, I had to learn from her Uncle Ken on how to interact with her, instead of being so strict. Now I had learned, but they weren't happy with it. On Monday, I sent my resignation letter to Sarah's email and began writing handover documents. Within 5 minutes, Sarah summoned me to her office with a cold tone. "What are you trying to pull now?" I replied, "Resigning. What else would it be?" She let out a laugh, as if she had heard a joke. She said, "How old are you? Still trying to threaten people with resignation?" Sarah suddenly appeared somewhat helpless and said, "Michael, I apologize for my sister's attitude before, but why can't you get along with Ken? He's not even adopted. He's our biological brother." I had once hoped for that, too. But Ken didn't want it. From the first day he entered the house, I saw the jealousy and hostility in his eyes. Ken was determined to take everything that mattered to me. And I was tired. I no longer wanted to fight him. Of course, Sarah wouldn't believe it, so I said nothing and just looked at her. It seemed like she realized I was serious, and her expression grew increasingly grim. Finally, she coldly said, "If you want to resign, talk to Dad about it." I nodded. "I will, but you'll follow the process here too. Also, hurry up and find someone to take over my responsibilities, whether it's Ken or anyone else. In a month, I'll be gone." Sarah bit her lip and said, "Then leave." I turned to walk out, but when I reached the door, she called me back. "Are you resigning to save your relationship with Emily and Olivia? If so, I can talk to them." I interrupted her. "I'm doing this for myself. I'll leave now." After work, I received a call from my father, inviting me to dinner at home on Saturday. He also mentioned that Emily and Olivia would be there. After hanging up, I received a call from the lawyer, saying the divorce agreement had been drafted and would be sent to my email for me to review. I felt a surge of energy and quickly went home to check my email. After reading through it carefully, I was very impressed with the lawyer's efficiency and professionalism. The door opened, and Emily and Olivia had returned. They were an hour later than usual. I checked social media and didn't see any posts from Ken, unsure whether I had been blocked or if he simply hadn't posted anything. However, considering it takes about half an hour from school to home, they probably didn't have enough time to eat with Ken. Emily looked tired. She looked at me and said, "Today I went to pick up Olivia. Her teacher said she hasn't been paying attention in class lately and has been very irritable, often arguing with her classmates. Michael, no matter how angry you are, can you put it aside for now? Olivia is still your daughter. You're her father, and you can't just ignore her. I looked at Olivia. Every time I disciplined her, she'd run and hide behind her mother, crying and complaining. Emily would take the opportunity to scold me, saying my method was too harsh, that children need to be spoken to, not punished. I could discipline her, but did she really need it? I crouched down in front of her and asked, Olivia, is something bothering you? If you want to talk about it, I'm here. If it's within my power, I'll help you. Emily was right about one thing. Olivia was my daughter. Whether she was an adult or not, at least for now, I couldn't let a 7-year-old go down the wrong path. Olivia pressed her lips together and said without hesitation, I want my dad to always be my dad. I patted her head and promised, as long as you recognize me, I'll always be your dad. I turned to look at Emily, who also had a cold expression. She said sharply, Of course she'll recognize you. What are you even talking about? This didn't match the plot, I knew. According to what I understood, during the family dinner on Saturday, I would explode with anger, seeing the closeness between Emily, Olivia, and Ken. Emily would be completely disappointed in me and ask for a divorce. Olivia would point at me, saying she didn't want such a cruel man as her father. I had no expectations of Emily, but I couldn't deny that Olivia still tugged at my heart. So, this was her last chance. On Saturday, Emily, Olivia, and I arrived at the old house on time. As soon as the door opened, Ken was the first to greet me. He looked at me with joy and said, Brother, I'm really happy you came. His expression was so sincere. No wonder he could become the main character. I kept a neutral tone and replied, Dad asked me to come, so of course I had to. My father seemed a little awkward. He cleared his throat and said, All right, we're just having a meal as a family. No need to make it so formal. At the dinner table, my mother was very careful, serving Ken some food and then quickly serving me the same. My dad spoke up. By the way, Michael, don't bring up your resignation again. He put down his chopsticks and added, Dad will give you a long vacation, and when you come back, you can continue as vice president. As for Ken, I'll start a new company for you to gain experience, and when you're ready, you can join the main company. Ken smiled humbly and said, I have no objections. I'll listen to Dad. I do need more experience and need to learn more. But the way he gripped his chopsticks was so tight that he nearly broke them. Sarah looked at me with a smile and asked, Is the young master satisfied now? I smiled politely. Ken wasn't someone who would passively take a beating. He certainly had something planned. After dinner, my mother pulled me to a side room to chat. She asked how I was doing, and it felt like things were back to the way they were before Ken came. But still, something felt different. After talking with my mother, I went to the living room and heard voices coming from the garden. I walked over to see. In the garden, Olivia was looking down, too shy to meet Ken's eyes. She said, Sorry, Uncle, I decided to go watch the movie with Dad. Then she added hastily, But I'll watch other movies with you later. Ken's face paled slightly, but he gently reassured her. Silly child. There's no need to apologize. Watching a parent-child movie with your dad is completely normal. Emily looked at them with tenderness in her eyes and said softly, If only Michael cared as much as you do, Uncle Ken. Ken, understanding, said, Sis, don't say that. Brother acts this way because he cares about you all. Sometimes I wonder, if I hadn't come back to this house, would that have been better for everyone? Emily quickly interrupted. Don't say that, we never thought that. Olivia likes you very much. Olivia nodded repeatedly, saying, Uncle, I've always hoped you could be my dad, but Mom says Dad has done a lot for me, and I can't make him sad. At this moment, Ken noticed me. From an angle where Emily and Olivia couldn't see, he made a smug gesture with his mouth. Loser. Then, pretending to be surprised, he called out to me, "Brother!" Emily and Olivia were both startled and looked over at me, their faces filled with panic. Ken took 2 quick steps, grabbed my hand, and explained, "Brother, please listen to me. Just hear me out, okay?" His voice even had a hint of a sob. I calmly pried his hand away. Emily pursed her lips and said, "All right. Ken didn't mean anything by it. We didn't say anything wrong. Michael, don't be like this." I was speechless. I hadn't said anything or done anything yet. Though Olivia was nervous, she stepped forward and stood in front of Ken, afraid I would hurt him. Ken said, "Sis, Olivia, can you both leave for a moment? I want to speak to Brother alone." Though they were worried, they listened to Ken and left, looking back at me and him constantly. I knew that wasn't worry for me. It was concern for Ken. Once it was just the 2 of us, Ken's expression changed. He sneered and said, "Does it hurt to see the person you care about only care for me, brother?" I was puzzled and asked, "Why do you have so much hatred for me? I was only 2 when you were taken away." Ken gradually became unhinged. "Because I can't accept it. Why, after all, are we both sons of the Johnson family? You've lived like a young master for over 20 years, while I've lived worse than a beggar. I know you look down on me because I only graduated from college, but I've been tortured by those 2 scumbags since I was young. I had to do all the household chores and never had time to study. I only managed to get into college because that family had an accident and died while I was in high school. That's when I was finally free. So I hate you. I will take everything you care about, everything you love." He calmed down, his malice completely unmasked, and said, "Now your parents, sister, wife, and daughter still care about you. But I'll tell you this, soon they will all completely despise you. Just wait," I asked calmly. "I thought you were jealous because you missed Mom and Dad, and maybe even fell in love with my wife?" He laughed as if hearing something absurd. "Them? They're just tools for my revenge. I want you to watch as your parents, sister, wife, and daughter all turn against you, abandon you." With that, he left, walking away with a smug look on his face. I watched his back, feeling no anger or anxiety, only curiosity. What was he going to do next? 3 days later, I found out. That morning, as I was just waking up, Emily barged into my bedroom, her face red with anger. Yes, since I was discharged from the hospital, I've been sleeping in a separate room from her. I had never seen Emily like this before. Her eyes swollen from crying, her face full of resentment. She screamed, "Ken has tried to kill himself. Are you happy now?" I was speechless. When we arrived at Ken's hospital room, I saw my parents and Sarah, all with red eyes, gathered around his bed. Olivia rushed over and cried, "Uncle, what happened to you?" "Don't scare me." When my mother saw me, her expression changed completely. She had always been gentle with me, but in that moment, she marched over and scolded me with fury. "What did you say to Ken that day? Why did he do this?" She looked at me with hatred and continued, "He swallowed an entire bottle of sleeping pills." My father stared at me coldly and said, "I've approved your resignation. From now on, you have nothing to do with the Johnson family. I won't argue with you about the money you've spent over the years, but don't expect a single cent from me in the future. All of the family assets will go to your sister and Ken." Sarah glared at me and said, "Don't even think about using the Johnson name to make money. If I find out, I won't let you off the hook." I nodded. Over the years, the money I made for the company far exceeded what the Johnson family had spent on me, so I owed them nothing. And during my time working there, I also made some personal investments with the salary I earned from Johnson, which allowed me to achieve financial freedom long before all this happened. Suddenly, my mother broke down in tears again, sobbing, "Michael, why have you become like this? Do you know that Ken wrote a suicide note saying he shouldn't have come back? When he was unconscious, he kept apologizing to you, saying he never wanted to take anything from you, that he didn't hate you. You two are brothers. Can't you forgive him?" I looked at my mother and thought, if Ken were awake right now, he would surely be enjoying this moment. I rolled my eyes and turned to leave. But the next moment, Emily stopped me, her voice trembling as she said, "Wait, I can't live with a man like you anymore. I'll contact a lawyer in the next few days to draft the divorce agreement." Olivia, wiping her face, chimed in, "Yes, a man like that doesn't deserve to be my dad." She shouted angrily, "I don't want such a malicious person to be my father." Those words were the final blow. Then she threw herself onto Ken's bed again, crying, "Uncle, I was wrong. From now on, I'll only listen to you. I'll watch that movie with you. Just please wake up." I coldly replied to Emily, "No need to wait for these 2 days. I already have the divorce agreement ready. If you have time, you can check it over. If everything is fine, just sign it." "What did you say?" Emily's face turned pale, and she looked at me in disbelief. "You already have the divorce agreement? When did you prepare it?" I smiled slightly and replied, 2 days after I was discharged from the hospital." Emily's chest heaved as she stammered, "Michael, how dare you?" Sarah couldn't tolerate my indifference anymore and grabbed my left hand forcefully, saying, "Go and apologize to Ken. Don't stop until he wakes up, or I'll never acknowledge you as my brother again." I raised my right hand and shoved her away. Before she could say anything else, I frowned and said, "Miss Johnson, my left hand was severely injured. I hope you won't grab it so tightly." Sarah froze, her expression changing instantly. My parents also looked shocked, their faces turning pale. I knew they remembered now. Years ago, when our family was attacked by enemies after the bankruptcy, it was my left hand that was shattered while protecting them. Since then, I couldn't lift heavy objects or move with agility. Sarah's lips trembled, and she stepped back, her face as white as a ghost. I looked at them and said, "If there's nothing else, I'll be leaving now." As I was about to exit the room, I thought I heard a whisper, "Michael." The next day, Emily and I went to the Civil Affairs office to finalize the divorce. When she returned home with Olivia the day before, she saw me waiting with the printed divorce agreement in hand. She had no way to avoid it, and because of her harsh words before, she could only grit her teeth and sign it. After leaving the Civil Affairs office, I immediately called a moving company to move my already packed belongings out of the house I had lived in for so many years. After the 1-month waiting period, we met again at the Civil Affairs office. I was the first to sign. Her hands trembled slightly. Suddenly, she threw the pen down in anger and yelled, "Michael, you're so cruel! To prove you don't care, you're even willing to abandon your own daughter." At this, the staff at the Civil Affairs office gave me strange looks. It was laughable. Now she was trying to claim the moral high ground, throwing dirt at me. During this entire month, we hadn't contacted each other at all. Meanwhile, Ken had been sending messages every day, boasting about how Emily had been going to care for him, and how Olivia visited him often. To prevent Emily from focusing too much on taking care of Ken and forgetting about the divorce, I made sure to remind her before the waiting period ended. It was much later when I received her angry voice message reply. She said, "Don't worry, I'll be there." Bringing myself back to the moment, I frowned and replied, "Aren't you happy that you can finally be with my brother?" Her face turned deathly pale. The energy drained from her, and she quickly signed the papers. We left the Civil Affairs office, and with a smile on my face, I said, "Goodbye, Emily," never to see her again. 5 years later, my wife, Sophia, our son, Leo, and I returned to the country. Leo, riding on my back, said, "Dad, are you tired? I can walk by myself." Sophia smiled and added, "Your son's worried about you. Let me carry him for a bit." Leo wasn't heavy, so carrying him wasn't a problem, but I decided to give in and handed him over to Sophia. However, just as I did, a voice, trembling with confusion, called out, "Dad?" I turned around to see Emily and Olivia standing there, staring at me. It had been years since we last saw each other. Olivia had grown taller, while Emily looked much more worn out. Emily's voice trembled as she said, "Michael, you're back." She stepped forward to grab my hand, but I quickly took a step back, avoiding her touch. That's when she noticed Sophia beside me. She asked, "Who is she?" Emily's eyes flashed with anger. I replied politely, "This is my wife, and this is my son." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You're married, and you have a child?" Leo tilted his head in confusion and asked, "Dad, who are they?" Olivia retorted, "He's my dad, not your dad." Like an angry little lion, she rushed toward me, but I quickly stepped in front of Leo and pushed her back. She froze, tears welling up in her eyes, and said, "Dad, don't you want me anymore?" She cried and sobbed, saying, "I was wrong, Dad. I shouldn't have believed that bad person. Please come back. I only want you as my dad. I won't trust anyone else again." Emily's eyes were red as she said, "Why didn't you give us the recording earlier? If I had seen it sooner, I wouldn't have married that bastard Ken." At that moment, a luxurious car stopped by the roadside, and the driver quickly got out and walked toward us. The driver said, "Madam, I'm sorry I'm late." I gestured for Sophia to take Leo and get in the car first. She gave me a glance and whispered in my ear, "Come back soon, or I'll get jealous." I shot her a look and replied, "My taste isn't bad enough to go back to someone like her." Once they got in the car, I turned to Emily and said with a smile, "I deliberately made sure you ended up with Ken. How else could I justify the pain I went through all those years?" Emily's face went pale. "I'm sorry, Michael. I knew you wouldn't forgive me and Olivia, but I still held on to a glimmer of hope." Olivia was crying uncontrollably. She shouted, "Dad, I really know I was wrong. Give me one more chance, just one last chance." I bent down, sighed, and said, "You used up that last chance 5 years ago. Let's just say our father-daughter bond was shallow, Olivia. The only advice I have for you is to look forward, not back at things that can never be undone." She wanted to say more, but I didn't give her the chance. I turned and got into the car. A month after I left, Emily married Ken, and my father officially appointed Ken as vice president of Johnson. I kept an eye on them, and after Ken had secured his position and Emily got pregnant, I sent a recording to Johnson's family and Emily's phone. It was of the conversation between Ken and me in the garden of the old house. After sending it, I stopped caring about them. Until today. Once we got in the car, Sophia, along with our domestic branch employees, greeted me, and she started reporting on the recent situation of the Johnson family and Emily and Olivia. In short, things hadn't gone well for them. After Emily learned the truth, she broke down. No matter how much Ken begged her, she insisted on divorcing him, even though she was pregnant and had to terminate the pregnancy. During an argument, Ken missed a step and fell down the stairs, breaking his leg. Emily held a grudge against him for his actions and refused to call for help. By the time they got him to the hospital, his leg was beyond saving, and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Ken tried to get Johnson's family to intervene, but they saw him as a foe after receiving the recording. His mother avoided him, his father cruelly mocked him, saying that a disabled man didn't deserve to inherit the Johnson family business, and Sarah even kicked him out of the house. With nowhere else to go, he clung to the idea of not divorcing. But Emily grew more and more distant, even moving to another house with Olivia. Ken, filled with resentment, secretly sold the confidential information he had collected about Johnson and Lewis companies to rival firms. Both companies suffered significant setbacks in crucial projects, their cash flows were cut off, and they nearly went bankrupt. Now, both companies were barely holding on, having to sell assets and downsize. Ken, on the other hand, was sent to a care facility by the angry families of both companies. Sarah spared him from the asylum, But the facility he was sent to was a beautiful, peaceful place, though he would never leave. He would likely remain there for years, and eventually he might even end up in the asylum after all. When I heard this, I chuckled and said, "Well, I should thank Ken. Without him, we wouldn't have gotten this advantage." Sophia smiled, wrapping herself around me, and said, "So it's all thanks to you, right? Didn't you sell their company secrets?" She then remembered something and looked worried. "I saw your daughter crying and begging today. You didn't soften, did you? You didn't, right? You can't be soft-hearted." I rubbed my forehead, exasperated. "Are you done yet?" Glancing at our son, who had already fallen asleep, I softened and said, "Leo's my only child." She snorted. "Well, that's better." I said, "Wife, if you're so worried, why don't we have more kids? Let's have a few more." "Oh, wait, I'm sorry, wife." Before I could finish, Sophia angrily pinched my arm. During my time back in the country, my father, mother, and Sarah all came to see me, but each time I avoided them. Eventually, I couldn't avoid them anymore and had to face them. Years had passed, and my parents had aged significantly. Even Sarah had a few strands of white hair, clearly showing how much they had been burdened by the company's issues over the years. My mother grabbed my hand, tears in her eyes. My father sighed deeply. And Sarah hesitated, but in the end, she didn't say a word. They apologized, begged for my forgiveness, admitting that they had been blinded by their own judgments and didn't realize how wicked Ken was. They said they hoped I would return, and that the family business would still be mine to inherit. I politely declined, saying, "I'm here today to tell you that my connection with you ended 5 years ago. I hope you won't come looking for me anymore. If you do, I can't guarantee how much Johnson's assets will sell for." Without waiting for their reaction, I stood up and left. Behind me, I could hear their regretful sighs. It felt like a lifetime ago. After that, they never came to find me again. As for Olivia, I don't know what Emily told her, but they never appeared in front of me again. However, on the day Sophia, Leo, and I were leaving for M Country after handling the acquisition, our bodyguard informed us that 5 people, 4 adults and 1 child, had been secretly watching us at the airport. The bodyguard was someone Sophia hired, worried that these people might harass me again. Leo, a bit anxious, asked, "Are they the people who said they were from Dad's family?" I smiled and pinched his cheek. "They're just unrelated people." After we entered the boarding gate, I received a few messages from unknown numbers on my phone. I glanced at them, and they all contained words like, "Forgive me," "I'm sorry," and "I'll always wait for you." I didn't open them in detail and simply deleted them all at once. The people who abandoned me are part of yesterday's past, but it's okay. I looked at Sophia and Leo. At least fate allowed me to find the one who truly loves me.